Pacers player free agency previews for two key vets for the Pacers, James Johnson, George Hill. What do the Pacers need to consider in free agency for both? Should they bring them back? If they only can bring one back, which one should it be? We'll get to it all today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, back on the free agency preview front. A lot of draft talk last week, and there will be more this week. In fact, two prospects coming to lay out the week here in a second, but today, pivoting back to looking ahead at free agency, finishing up doing the players, the Pacers players. We did O'Shea Brissett on his extension eligibility date last month. Today we'll do two vets in James Johnson and George Hill. Later this week, we'll do the two-way guys, Kendall Brown and Gabe York. And then next month, all the free agency review podcasts will be external. What point guards, shooting guards, all the positions should the Pacers, what players should they look at each spot? Why should they look at a player from that spot, if at all? Who makes sense? Who's in their price range? All sorts of detailed breakdowns. Have done this series every single year, but the players have to start internally because that's where the conversations will start for the team as well. In fact, the new CBA kind of changes the dates for when those conversations can even start. So this week, those two episodes, the internal free agents, as well as two prospect breakdowns, the Thompson twins coming this week, Ahmed and Asar. And then the last episode this week will be about cap space for the Pacers this week, because now that the picks are set, there is actually a dollar amount you can put on how much cap space the Pacers should have up at the draft. Now, how much will they have in free agency will depend on draft night, but we'll get to all that preview when the time comes. Today, we're talking about George Hill and James Johnson's upcoming free agency. Both provided different and unique roles for the Pacers this year. We'll start with George Hill, the hometown kid. The way I've done this series, I guess, if you can even call it that, for years and years, is the pros of bringing the player back, the cons of bringing the player back, and then what I ultimately think will happen. I usually do one player per episode, but with these guys who didn't play much, the two-way guys and these vets, I'll just lump them into one. So I'll talk all that stuff for George Hill, and then at the end, we'll do do I think they'll be brought back for both players. But for Hill, and this will be the similar talk for Johnson, I think it starts with off-court stuff, right? George Hill is a flawless off-court addition, quite frankly, for the Pacers. Indie kid, knows the city well, knows the league well, has been around for forever, got drafted in 2008, 15 years ago now, right? Has played with Giannis, has played with LeBron, has played with Embiid, right? Has played with Paul George, has played with, I'm missing one superstar in his run of crazy team runs, but whoever he was with in Utah for that 1 year, right? Tim Duncan, right? Like, his pedigree of studs that he's played with is kind of insane. So that is obviously very valuable. He's seen it up close. He knows how to share that information with younger teammates. His current Pacer teammates who are younger gushed about it during the season. That is similar profile, but different players to James Johnson. That is one of the biggest benefits of George Hill being on the Pacers. But he's not like a washed veteran player, right? Obviously, that end of the season game he had against the Knicks inflate some of his stats somewhat. I think he was 5 for 7 from 3, had like 17 points. An insane performance. He had a half-court shot in that game, right? Obviously a little inflating. But even outside of that game, he was fine, right? He played 46 games this past season. He played a lot with the Bucks, right? He is still capable of playing some. For the full season, he had 47, 36, 76 splits. That's fine. His assist-to-turnover ratio for the whole season as a point guard, more of a steady hand than a point guard in general, but 110 assists, 34 turnovers, right? And the only reason I'm doing high-level stuff and not getting into the nitty-gritty, he didn't play a lot for the Pacers. It's not worth getting into, only 166 minutes. But in general, just high-level statistical profile, still a totally fine NBA player, even at 37 years old. He'll turn 38 next May, but he'll be 37 for all of the upcoming season, right? So he's a great vet, and he can still kind of play, right? 46 games is a decent amount for one season, right? It's not a lot, but it shows that, like, it's not like the rigor of the season is too much for you, or you're just incapable of playing a lot in a season. Okay. Still kind of got it from three, right? That league average number is there. And of course, with the Pacers specifically, that last game inflates it, but he shot 52.4% for the season, 36%. That's still fine. In his since 2020-21, right? So the last 3 seasons, even 34% from deep. That's fine. It's not great. You want better, of course. But if you're talking about your 15th guy out of 15 who's actually going to play, that's fine. And in terms of finances, because this is a free agency discussion, the Pacers have early bird rights on Hill, right? He just finished up the second year of an $8 million deal. They have early bird rights, so there's no financial restrictions. They could give him any reasonable contract, any legal deal, up to any amount. They have cap space anyway, but if they use their cap space first, they could still circle around and re-sign him to anything. He's a minimum player at this stage of his career. I think that's sort of obvious, but if there is sort of any negotiation that needs to be had, no problem. Pacers can offer him any legal amount that would actually make sense to bring him back, right? So there are several pros and very few restrictions. And I view this as a pro too, right? And I've talked about this a lot with Hill specifically, going back 2 seasons to the Brad Wanamaker, Kiefer Sykes, whoever else you want to throw in there, Dwayne Washington for a stint. Backup point guard problem the Pacers had when Brogdon was hurt and LeVert was hurting, and they just had no one at the spot before they got Halliburton. And that really displayed the value of, even at the backup spot, McConnell had the broken wrist as well, of quality point guard play. When they had nothing, that team was trying to win and they couldn't do anything. They were terrible in that mid to late December stretch, early January. That's where their season turned. That's when all the reports about them doing the trading came. I mean, that the reports came a little before that, but then they really stunk. Like, it was all just a disaster. And point guard play is important. And so Hill not being useless right now at a position where you always need some depth, right? Gabe York provided some at times this year too. I think that is important. I think being at that specific position, I think James Johnson position matters too, right? We'll get to that. But I think that matters for George Hill and the calculus of his free agency. And of course, the final thing, the legend of Indy, right? From here, went to college here, had the choice to leave or stay at the trade deadline, chose to stay once that Haslam-like role with this team. Like, that's not a sexy role. It's not something guys are chasing, especially in Indiana. Wanting that, of course, matters. So there are a decent amount of pros to me to a George Hill reunion, even if it is just in a veteran role. There are plenty. Now, the cons is going to be the similar-ish for James Johnson, but it's all about roster spots, right? He's a free agent. Hill is. Johnson is. O'Shea Brissett is. That's it for standard roster spots for the Pacers. They also have a ton of cap space and 5 draft picks. Now, Kevin Pritchard said again at the draft lottery, they're not going to pick 5 times. They're just not. But they have more stuff to use to get players than roster spots to actually add players. George Hill, the biggest con for basically anyone the Pacers sign is the opportunity cost of then using that roster spot on someone else, on a young player or on someone who can help their defense or on a draft pick or whatever it may be. And maybe they think Hill can do some of those things. And I think veteran leadership is important and should use a roster spot, but it's still the opportunity cost of what it would allow them to do instead when they are in such a tight crunch for the roster spot already. That's like, obviously he's not even a rotation level player anymore. He's close, but he's not even a rotation level guy anymore. That's a con, of course, but that's not the expectation for a signing like George Hill. He's not brought in to be a rotation level player, but you could call his ability level a con, and I think that would be fine. You know, it's a player who is a negative value basketball player taking up a roster spot, right? Udonis Haslam's a bad contract for the Heat. He is invaluable to them. There's a reason they keep doing the same deal with him over and over and over again, but it's also like the opportunity cost is the same for them. They're rostering a player that never plays, and they can't bring in someone else in that spot. George Hill's better than Haslam right now, obviously, but you get what I'm saying. There are cons, obviously, at his ability level, but I think the pros also exist, and it would make sense for them to bring him back. But should they? Well, we'll talk about that in the third segment. First, we got to talk about James Johnson. What makes his free agency considerations different than George Hill? Should they bring him back? What are the pros and cons there? He had a fun season for the Pacers this year. We'll get to that coming up in a second. Before we do so, though, I got to talk to you guys about the great people over at PrizePicks. We're doing a $1 million competition throughout the ongoing NBA playoffs. Super flex promotion every day of the playoffs. One PrizePicks user won a chance of becoming a millionaire. You can do one entry placed after 8 a.m. every day. One will be randomly selected throughout all the submissions. Whoever placed that entry will be given a six-pick flex with the following payouts. 6 correct picks, $1 million. 5 gets you 80,000. 4 gets you 16,000. Full details at prizepicks.com/million. You got to opt in at that link to be eligible. Once you opt in, you just play the game like normal. You could be the lucky winner. How do you play? Pick a player and they're over under. You get it right, you can win. You can do up to 2 to 6 players, and if they will score more or less in their prize picks projection for up to a chance to up to 25 times your money. For example, it's the conference finals. Will LeBron have more or less than 7.5 rebounds? It's just you versus prize picks projections. You can do it quickly and safely and get your money from the app quickly when you win. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com. Sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit 100, PrizePicks will give you 100. You deposit 50, PrizePicks will give you 50. But don't forget to enter the promo code LOCKEDON to sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, go to Locked On Bucks, because I was just there with their host Kane Pittman talking about Frank Vogel, a potential candidate for the Bucks head coaching opening. Excuse me, I almost said free agent opening. Head coaching opening. We also talk about George Hill on that episode, and Jordan Nwora and Malcolm Brogdon, and all sorts of Pacers Bucks overlapping topics, but mostly about Frank Vogel. Would he fit in Milwaukee? Yeah, I kind of think so. But get into the conversation with me and Kane over at Locked On Bucks. Here, we're talking about James Johnson, his free agency coming up for the Pacers. One of the last signings the Pacers had last offseason, just before their golf outing. Him and Langston Galloway, if you'll recall, brought in to kind of compete for the exact role that Johnson ended up having all season, right? The veteran guy. Here's how I know James Johnson did a good job in that role. I can tell you everything players said James Johnson did. And I can tell you what James Johnson said that James Johnson did. And I can even explain to you what I personally saw and heard James Johnson did. And you could hear all that, and that's great. That is all secondhand accounts of it that you personally couldn't see. But what you can see is the Pacers going out of their way to keep James Johnson after a string of transactions at the trade deadline that required them waiving him to facilitate the trade. I guess not him specifically, but he was the only minimum salary guy, and they still brought him back. That action alone should tell you everything you need to know about James Johnson. The Pacers needed to clear a roster spot to make that trade. They cut James Johnson, and they were hoping they could keep him and bring him back, and they were. Once he cleared waivers, they brought him right back because they believed he was that valuable to the team this year. The players thought so, and the front office thought so. He like Hill, has had a very unique career playing with stars, right? One of them, I think, that is unique to his situation that kind of applies to the Pacers is he played with Derrick Rose really early in his career when Derrick Rose was an ascending MVP level player with the Bulls. And, I asked James Johnson early in the season, do you remember anyone in your career as young as Tyrese Halliburton who was kind of a team leader on and off the court? And he said, yeah, Derrick Rose, right? Like that is a unique experience to have to apply to this team. He's also played with Raptors teams that made the conference finals, Grizzlies teams that were really good and had stars on them, Heat teams that were really good and had stars like D-Wade and Jimmy Butler on them, right? Dallas Mavericks with Rick Carlisle. I don't Kevin Durant. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing as George Hill. He's played with a bunch of stars. He played with really good teams. He's got that experience. That is, of course, valuable to the Pacers. That's why they wanted to bring in a vet last year, right? Scott Agnes was on this before me, but he was asking, front office people, coaches, like, do you feel like you need a vet on this team? And they're like, yeah, we do. That was over a year ago, and he was right. They brought in 2 vets to try to compete for the spot of the Pacers lead vet because they needed someone like that. And I was going to get to this in the third segment and will again, but you can see this on the teams playing in the conference finals right now. They all have kind of this sage vet who's been around, who knows stuff, who knows players, who's seen successful teams. James Johnson was that for the entire season for the Pacers. He's a great vet, right? That's the first line of my notes, but he can't really play anymore. He's kind of past the stage of being an impactful contributor, which is really fascinating to me because part of what stood out to me about his signing last year with the Pacers is the year prior, 2021-22, he played for the Nets like kind of a lot. They were a playoff team. The Nets made the postseason that year. James Johnson played 62 games for them in the rotation, right? 20 minutes a game. Now, right before the playoffs, he got cut so they could play Kessler Edwards. But he was on that team, a playoff level team for the whole season and played a lot. And it was a contributor. And this year, he just wasn't. I mean, maybe it's just that he was out of rhythm because he didn't play that much, or his game day routine changed because he wasn't playing as much. All sorts of things could be a factor here. He very rarely played, and he just wasn't that great. He was out there. He might be near the end of his impactful stint in the NBA, but he struggled until kind of the final game. He had a couple bright flashes against his former team. I think he had a game in Detroit that was pretty good. Yeah, 8 points, 5 rebounds, assists. But in general, until the very end of the season when they were tank-tastic, if you will, he's not a contributor on the floor anymore, unlike George Hill a little bit. But he does have some other pros that George Hill doesn't have. One is, if you remember, The Athletic did this survey poll of every NBA player, not every NBA player. They did a survey poll of several NBA players and said, who would you least like to fight in the NBA? And James Johnson dominated the category, even at his current age, right? Like martial arts expert, his family is, has done karate for forever, super tough, known guy. Like no one wants to get into it with James Johnson. That of course matters. That is a mantra that seeps into the rest of your team. And he plays a position need for the Pacers. I thought this was a big deal last year when I thought he could play a little more than he can, but he can play the 4. They have no one who can do that right now. O'Shea Brissett is a free agent. Like of the rostered Pacers players, zero of them are natural 4s. James Johnson might be, right? And even if he can't play that well anymore at his age, that is still something that they desperately need, right? Desperately need 4s. That's why I thought he was going to win the roster battle over Langston Galloway. He turned out to be exactly what the Pacers needed for many reasons, even beyond what position he plays. But I thought that the fact that he was a 4 alone was enough for him to win that battle. I still think that's important for how the Pacers are. He's on a minimum salary, so if you want to talk about the finances and the pros and cons there, I mean, they don't have a lot of flexibility in what they can offer him. Or non-bird rights doesn't give them a ton there, but he's not worth more than that. He's a minimum salary player at this point. They have the cap space, whatever exceptions you want to say, to keep him. There's no legal issues here in terms of, he's worth more than what they can offer or anything like that. He helped them, obviously, so much so that they brought him back. I think that's noteworthy. He plays a position that's important to what they need, even though he doesn't play particularly well. He's super tough, but he's just not that impactful of a player anymore. How do you kind of add all that up in a way that you can compare to George Hill, right? It's a little different. And so the pros are, like I just kind of listed them, but he's an A1 vet. They chose for that role last year. He filled it super well. The cons are the same as they were for George Hill. By signing James Johnson, you can no longer use the roster spot he takes up on something else. That's the case for every player, but for guys who you're assigning to these back end of the roster roles, it's a little bit more like this could be a young project player in a way that you're not going to not have Buddy Hield to have a young project player, but you might sacrifice some veteran leadership for a young project player. You get what I'm saying? At the back end of the roster, there's a little more creativity and nuance involved in those choices, and the opportunity costs changes a little bit when you filled out more of the on-court everyday roles. And at the back end, you're looking for other sorts of stuff, and that is one of the big cons for both George Hill and James Johnson is exactly that. And for the Pacers, who are certainly in a roster spot crunch this season, deciding to bring them back or not, which one of them makes more sense if they decide only one? Those are important questions that they will have to figure out. So what should happen here? Who should the Pacers bring back? Both of these guys? One of these guys? None of these guys? How should they handle this? Does the salary cap situation matter? What other wrinkles are relevant in this discussion? Let's close out figuring all that out. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day for your second listen. Oh, my goodness, Locked On Heat has to be number 2. They're up 3-0, the 8th seed. They were 3 minutes away from losing to the Bulls in a play-in game, and now they're 1 game away from the finals. Locked On Nuggets as well. The finals is getting close to being set. Victor Oladipo could get a ring this year. Cody Zeller could get a ring this year. Or Pacers assistant Popeye Jones could get a ring this year. Check out Locked On Nuggets or Locked On Heat for your second listen today for your weekend of basketball. What do I think happens here? I like to talk about this with free agency stuff. I said with O'Shea Brissett, there's a good reason to bring him back. I've always thought of him more highly than the minutes he gets, but I don't think he'll be back just because of the roster spot crunch. It has nothing to do with what he did for the Pacers or his skill level. I just think that they don't have enough roster spots to retain him. That is the highest level crux of the argument for these two players as well. They do not. They have 3 roster spots, using 2 of them on 35-plus-year-old veteran players is kind of tough. 36-year-old plus veteran players at this point. Not to say that they're useless because of their age, but is there any duplication there? Are you overlapping veteran skill needs that you don't need to, especially when neither of them can play that well anymore? Or you don't want them to be an everyday player? That means something else has gone wrong in your season, right? How do you bake that all in? And so that's why I think You might need two of them, but you don't need two of them. The Pacers only entered last season with one of them, right? They got rid of Langston Galloway. James Johnson was their one. When they got George Hill, they offered him a choice, right? They said, "Hey, we'll cut you if you want to be cut." It's not like they were so married to keeping him. Now, granted, he wants to retire a Pacer, he said, and would love that Haslam role. And he stayed on the rest of the season and played fine and was a great locker room guy. So that's totally fine. It's not like they made a mistake in keeping him, but they don't need two of these guys. And there's a lot of evidence that says they know that. They only carried one last year when they were more youth facing than they will be next year, right? So this is an interesting role, right? I think it's important. I kind of talked about this in the last segment. Even now, we're in the conference finals, the apex of conference basketball, about to be in the NBA finals. All four teams left. You could argue have a guy fitting this very rarely plays veteran role, right? The Denver Nuggets have DeAndre Jordan, who they played a little bit early in the season, but he's that for them. The Los Angeles Lakers signed a former Pacer, Tristan Thompson, to have this role the day before the end of the season. The Miami Heat have, of course, Haslam, the king of kings in this role. And the Celtics, to a lesser extent for this, though, they have Blake Griffin, right? They have not quite legends in the Thompson Haslam category, although close. They have really talented players with rich league histories, good vets who know how to play on star teams, who know how to be a part of that, right? It's an important role. Teams are valuing it, I feel like, more and more every year, including the Pacers, who, again, went out of their way to sign these guys last year and have them battle out in camp. So I think the value of a vet, even one that never plays, is obvious, and why I think at least one of these two is back, but I think only one is back. That said, right, there's a reason these guys are respected and why younger players always gas them up, because they have a lot of value to the team. They're for bonding reasons or for advice reasons or whatever that may be, right? I was talking to some people recently about these kind of players. If you're a veteran like this, who's the leader, you either have to never play or play a lot and well. Like if you play a lot and well, guys are going to follow suit with what you do because you're busting your butt out there and playing well. And if you never play, guys are going to listen to you because you're likely a vet, like a long time vet at that stage, and people know you know what you're talking about. If you're one of those vets who plays a little bit and you play like crap, it's really hard to have a voice, I feel like, because your teammates are like, you're not that good. But these James Johnson and George Hill are both in the sweet spot of don't play so much that it's a hindrance. And so they're, I think, extremely valuable vets in this situation. So which one, if they can only bring back one, right? Because that is what I think the case will be. The Pacers only rostered one vet last year to start the season. At the trade deadline, yeah, they were still kind of fighting for the playoffs, but they could get away with rostering George Hill. I think they only roster one. So the question is, which one, right? Which one of the two makes more sense? I found it valuable last summer that James Johnson was a forward, and they needed forwards, and they still need forwards. His position matters. But he also wasn't that impactful this season as a player at all in his very few appearances, granted, but 18 over the whole season. He played 18 games. Right, he topped out at barely 150 minutes, barely played. George Hill, more impactful as a player, right? 40 something games this season. I closed his basketball reference page, so that was stupid of me. 46 games this season, many more, right? 834 minutes. That's like a back end rotation level player of minutes. Can still kind of play. More impactful on the court. Also plays point guard. Right? As I said in his segment, an important position to have depth at. You never want to be stunk. You never want to be stuck playing a guy at point guard who can't do it. Right? The Pacers had that game where they tried to play James Johnson at point guard for like 10 minutes in Portland with everybody out for that game. Halliburton didn't play. McConnell started. James Johnson was the backup at first, and then someone else didn't play. I think McConnell didn't play because it was just Nembhard and James Johnson. Then they just went to Buddy Hield at the one in the second half. Right? You need point guard depth. And so Hill has that going for him. And so positionally, I kind of call it a wash, right? I think that if it was any other position, they have too many twos. So if it was a two, that would be bad. If it was a three, that would be bad, although they could use threes. If it was a five, that'd be awful. But the four, they need guys at, and I think the one is always valuable to have depth. And so the positions are a wash. And so here's why I'll make my pick. Why I think George Hill would be the one they would pick over James Johnson, even though James Johnson was awesome for them last year, and they kept him after the trade deadline. They brought him back. I think it'll be George Hill because, one, he's better. He is a better player right now, right? That has to matter if you have to have a tiebreaker. And I think him being better matters. I also think him being from Indy matters. Being a part of this team the last time the Pacers were at their absolute best has to matter. He's seen what it takes for the culture to be like that in this exact market. That is important. And I think that's going to be a differentiating factor here. The point guard thing matters. The Indiana ties matters. And he said he wants to retire a Pacer. You can't retire a Pacer if you're not a Pacer. Now, granted, he could just never play again. And in theory, his last game would be with the Pacers. But like a final season might make some sense for him. I don't know. There's not a wrong answer to this question at all. Like if they bring back James Johnson and not George Hill, I think that would be fine. There's not a bad answer, but I think George Hill is the slightly better answer because of his ties to the city, the fact that he's still a little bit better of a player. I think those are going to be the two differentiating factors. Could they bring back both? I guess they could. I think what it would take though is a lot of trades. Like they clear 3, 4, 5 roster spots in trades, and all of a sudden they're like, you know what, we can bring back both vets and still use our other 13 NBA spots productively and not be worried about our depth, right? If you're worried about your depth, you need it, then bringing back both vets does not make a lot of sense. But in the absence of that, if they just do a few roster spot opening trades or a few consolidation trades, whatever words you want to use, I feel like they only bring back one of these guys. And if I had to guess, I would say George Hill. Now, granted, this is all guessing. This is not reporting. This is not something I've talked to anyone about, but just looking at all the factors at play between their know-how, their abilities at this stage, their ties to the franchise, what they can and can't do anymore. I think George Hill has the very, very, very slight edge over James Johnson. But we'll see if either of them are ultimately back with the Pacers next year, because you only have 3 roster spots. You never know what is and isn't going to be available and what bridges you could force yourself to not cross by filling up one of your roster spots. We'll see. These guys are both minimum players. They're not going to help that much towards the floor. They're not like big opportunity costs if you have to cut them kind of guys, but you still would like to use your roster spots to the maximum you possibly can, and that is always tricky when you're on a roster spot crunch. We'll see. We will see. If you think I missed anything in this discussion, comment on YouTube, tweet at me at Tony R. East, or this podcast at Locked On Pacers. That would be much appreciated. If you're interested in more draft content, I have a lot up on the Pacers SI site right now, including a conversation I had with Jarris Walker, detailing all the picks, talking about Leonard Miller, Anthony Black, the Thompson twins, etc. It's all there at SI Pacers. Like I said at the top, the rest of this week on this show, talking about the free agency for the two-way guys, Kendall Brown and Gabe York, talking about both Thompson twins, and talking cap space for our remaining episodes. Should be tons and tons of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed today's show. Like I said, I'm on Twitter at Tony R. East. If you have anything to say, thank you so much for listening. Hope you had a fantastic weekend, and we will see you